Imagine trying to fall asleep in a room where 1,500 clocks are ticking, not the same tick, not the clean, metronomic pulse of a single clock on a mantelpiece that you have learned to ignore over years of living with it. 1,500 different ticks, in 1,500 different rhythms, at 1,500 different pitches, some deep and heavy, the measured heartbeat of a grandfather clock whose pendulum swings through a full second with the gravity of a pronouncement, some light and rapid, the nervous flutter of a French carriage clock whose escapement runs at a higher frequency, some almost inaudible, the whispered breath of a pocket watch laid face down on a velvet surface, its tiny balance wheel oscillating 17,000 times per hour in the dark. Add to the ticking the chiming, because many of these clocks chime on the hour, on the half hour, on the quarter, which means that almost every 15 minutes, from somewhere in the room, a voice arrives. A bell. A sequence of bells. Multiple sequences, overlapping, because 1,500 clocks do not agree on the exact time, cannot agree. Their individual rates of drift and gain accumulating over hours into a beautiful, maddening asynchrony, a rolling chorus of chimes in which no two clocks strike the same note at precisely the same moment. James Arthur slept in this room every night. By choice, with evident contentment, and by most accounts, extremely well. Before we go any further, close your eyes for a moment and try to actually hear it. 1,500 clocks. The ticking is not noise. For a man who has chosen it, it is company. It is the sound of time itself being measured. The universe's most fundamental process made audible by 1,500 ingenious machines that a human being spent his entire adult life accumulating around himself. That is either the most peaceful thing you have ever imagined or the most alarming. There is probably no middle ground. James Arthur was born in New York in 1842. He made a fortune in business, the dry goods trade, then manufacturing, the kind of Victorian commercial success that required a particular combination of intelligence and nerve, and willingness to work at a scale and pace that consumed most of the people who attempted it. He was not a watchmaker. He was not a scientist. He was a businessman who became, over the course of a long life, one of the most serious and knowledgeable collectors of horology, the science and art of timekeeping that the world has ever seen. At his death in 1930, at the age of 88, his collection contained 1,500 clocks and watches, spanning 4 centuries of human ingenuity. He had written a book about them, a substantial scholarly work that remained a standard reference in the field for decades. He had given lectures. He had corresponded with the leading horologists in Europe and America. He had, in the most literal sense possible, given his life to time. This is his story, and the story of the objects he loved, and the story of what it means to spend a lifetime trying to understand the one thing that none of us can stop, reverse, or ever quite hold in our hands. The New York that James Arthur grew up in was a city obsessed with time in a way that earlier cities had not been, and that no city had ever quite been before. The Industrial Revolution had done something to time that the Agricultural Revolution had not done, and that no previous transformation of human society had done. It had made punctuality a moral virtue. It had made the clock the arbiter of the working day, the judge of who was late and who was on time, the instrument by which the relationship between labor and capital was organized and measured and enforced. The factory whistle, the railroad schedule, the synchronized clocks that cities were beginning to install in their public spaces so that their inhabitants could agree, for the first time in human history, on what time it was. Before the railroad, there had been no particular reason for cities to agree on time with each other. Boston ran on Boston time. New York ran on New York time. The difference was small, a matter of minutes, but it was real, rooted in the actual position of each city relative to the sun, and it did not matter until the railroad made it matter. When a train departed New York and arrived in Boston, what time did it arrive? In New York time or Boston time? The answer, when multiplied across hundreds of trains and dozens of cities, produced a chaos of conflicting schedules that the railroad companies solved, eventually, by inventing time zones, by dividing the continent into regions that would agree to share a single official time regardless of what the sun was actually doing at any given moment. James Arthur came of age in this world, in this city, at the moment when time was being transformed from a natural phenomenon, the position of the sun, the length of the shadow, into a social agreement, a manufactured standard, a technology. He was, from the beginning, fascinated by the technology. His first clock acquisition is not precisely documented. What the historical record gives us is the picture of a man who, by his 30s and 40s, was already buying clocks and watches with the focused intensity of a person who has found his subject. The dry goods trade and later manufacturing provided the money. The money went, with a consistency that his business partners found slightly bewildering, into clocks. To understand what James Arthur was collecting, it helps to understand what a clock actually is, not in the everyday sense that most of us know, but in the deeper sense that a collector with Arthur's knowledge understood. A clock is a machine for dividing time into equal parts and counting those parts. The difficulty of doing this accurately is one of the great engineering challenges in human history, and the solutions that inventors found to that challenge, over 4 centuries of clockmaking, are among the most beautiful and most ingenious objects that human hands have ever produced. The fundamental problem is this: time is continuous, but counting requires discrete units. To count seconds, you need something that happens once per second with complete regularity, a pendulum that swings, a balance wheel that oscillates, a quartz crystal that vibrates. The mechanism that converts the continuous flow of time into discrete, countable units is called the escapement, and the history of clockmaking is largely the history of successive improvements to the escapement. Each improvement buying a small increment of accuracy, each increment representing years or decades of the most refined mechanical thinking available in its era. The verge escapement, used in the earliest mechanical clocks of the 13th and 14th centuries, was inaccurate enough that clocks of that period could gain or lose 15 minutes per day, which sounds terrible by modern standards, but was, for its time, a genuine revolution in the human relationship with time. The anchor escapement, developed in the 17th century, reduced that error dramatically. The lever escapement, which is still used in mechanical watches today, reduced it further. The marine chronometer, developed in the 18th century to solve the problem of determining longitude at sea, was accurate to within a few seconds per day, accurate enough to navigate by, accurate enough to save the lives of sailors who had previously been navigating by guesswork and dying on rocks they could not see. Each of these improvements was embodied in specific mechanisms, specific watches and clocks, that Arthur collected. His collection was not a random accumulation of beautiful objects. It was a systematic library of mechanical solutions to a single problem: how to measure time accurately arranged in historical sequence, from the earliest surviving examples to the most recent achievements of the craft. Arthur began collecting seriously in the 1870s when he was in his 30s. The market for antique clocks and watches in New York at this period was not what it would later become. The great auction houses were beginning to deal in horology, but the specialist knowledge required to distinguish the genuinely significant from the merely old was not widely distributed, and the prices for important pieces were, by the standards of later generations, low. Arthur educated himself with the thoroughness of a man who had applied the same approach to business, reading everything, consulting experts, handling as many objects as he could get access to, building up through direct experience the kind of tactile and visual knowledge that cannot be acquired from books alone. He traveled to Europe, where the great clockmaking traditions of England, France, Germany, and Switzerland had produced the most significant examples of the craft, and where the dealers and auction houses had the deepest stocks of historical material. He was, by all accounts, a difficult customer in the best sense, deeply informed, skeptical of provenance claims that could not be substantiated, willing to pay significant prices for pieces he believed were important, but unwilling to be moved by sentiment or salesmanship alone. The dealers who worked with him over the years developed a respect for his knowledge that went beyond the usual commercial relationship. He was, increasingly, as much a peer as a customer, a man whose opinion on a disputed piece was worth having. There is a particular pleasure in becoming genuinely expert in something that most people know only superficially. The pleasure of seeing what others cannot see, of picking up an object that looks, to the untrained eye, like one of many similar objects, and recognizing in it the specific signature of a specific maker, the evidence of a particular innovation, the physical record of a solution to a problem that had occupied the best mechanical minds of a generation. Arthur was developing that pleasure in his 30s and 40s, and it would sustain him for the rest of his life. The earliest pieces in Arthur's collection dated from the 15th and 16th centuries, from the period when mechanical clocks were first small enough to be portable and first accurate enough to be genuinely useful for anything beyond marking the rough divisions of the day. The German clockmakers of Nuremberg and Augsburg in the 16th century produced some of the most extraordinary objects in the history of horology, drum clocks, tabernacle clocks, and the so-called Nuremberg eggs, small oval watches that were among the first portable timekeepers, their cases elaborately engraved and gilded, their movements visible through pierced covers that were themselves works of decorative art. These pieces were not primarily functional instruments. They were demonstrations of wealth, of technical mastery, of the new human ability to carry time in the pocket rather than read it from the sky. Arthur had examples of these early German pieces. He had English lantern clocks from the 17th century, the tall, open-framed bracket clocks that stood on tables or shelves with their bells mounted on top, their movements driven by hanging weights and regulated imperfectly by the first generation of pendulums. He had French mantel clocks from the 18th century, those extraordinarily elaborate objects in which the mechanism was enclosed in cases of ormolu and marble and Sèvres porcelain. The clock itself, almost secondary to the sculptural program that surrounded it, cherubs and classical figures and allegories of the hours, rendered in gilded bronze of extraordinary quality. He had English bracket clocks in ebonized cases, Dutch long case clocks with their painted dials showing moon phases and tidal information, Vienna regulators with their long, thin pendulums beating seconds in tall, glazed mahogany cases, Swiss pocket watches in enamel cases painted with miniature scenes of extraordinary delicacy. He had astronomical clocks that showed not just the time but the positions of the planets and the phases of the moon and the day of the year, mechanisms of such complexity that their makers had devoted years to their construction, had in some cases never built another. Among the most significant pieces in the collection were the marine chronometers, the instruments that had solved one of the great practical problems of the age of exploration. The problem of longitude had haunted navigators for centuries. Latitude, how far north or south you were, could be determined by observing the sun or the stars. Longitude, how far east or west required knowing the exact time at a known location, which could then be compared to local time determined by astronomical observation. The difference between the two times gave the longitude. Simple in principle, impossible in practice, until someone could build a clock accurate enough to keep time through weeks at sea, in conditions of temperature and humidity and constant motion that defeated every clockmaker who attempted the problem before John Harrison. Harrison was an English carpenter and self-taught clockmaker who spent 40 years of his life building a series of marine timekeepers, designated H1, H2, H3, and H4, each more accurate and more portable than the last, culminating in the H4, a large pocket watch that, on a voyage to Jamaica in 1762, kept time to within 5 seconds over 81 days. 5 seconds. In 81 days of ocean sailing, of temperature changes, of the ship rolling and pitching in Atlantic weather, it was one of the greatest achievements of practical engineering in the 18th century, and it changed navigation completely. Arthur had marine chronometers, not Harrison's originals, which were already in institutional collections, but significant examples from the period after Harrison's breakthrough, when the marine chronometer became a standard instrument of navigation, and the great English chronometer makers, Arnold, Earnshaw, Mudge, Dent competed to build instruments of increasing accuracy and reliability. These were working instruments, not decorative objects. Their cases were plain mahogany boxes. Their dials were simple and functional. Their movements were the most precisely engineered mechanisms that 18th and 19th century technology could produce. They represented something that Arthur found deeply compelling: the moment when the science of timekeeping intersected with the practical problems of the world, when the watchmaker's art became literally a matter of life and death for the sailors who carried these instruments across the world's oceans. The watches in the collection numbered in the hundreds. They ranged from the earliest surviving examples of portable timekeeping to the finest productions of Swiss and English watchmaking in the 19th century. A watch is a different object from a clock. A clock stands still and you come to it. A watch comes with you. It is on your body, in your pocket, on your wrist, attached to your chain. Its dimensions are constrained by the human body that carries it, which means that every advance in watchmaking is also an advance in miniaturization, in the ability to build mechanisms of extraordinary complexity at scales that require not just skill, but a different relationship between the craftsman and the object. The great watchmakers of Geneva and London in the 18th and 19th centuries worked at scales that strained the imagination, balanced springs whose coils were thinner than human hair, jeweled bearings, rubies, and sapphires, chosen for their hardness that reduced friction in pivots a fraction of a millimeter in diameter, repeater mechanisms that could play a sequence of chimes to indicate the hour, quarter hour, and minute at the press of a button useful in an era before electric light, when telling the time in darkness required a mechanism rather than a glance. Perpetual calendar mechanisms that tracked the date and adjusted automatically for the varying lengths of months and the occurrence of leap years. Arthur had examples of all of these complications. He knew who had made them, when, why, and how the specific solution embodied in each mechanism related to the solutions that had come before and after it. He could hold a watch and read its history in the details of its movement the way a scholar reads a manuscript. The movement of a clock is not hidden, it is displayed. The wheels turning, the escapement releasing, the pendulum swinging, these are the clock's argument made visible. A collector of clocks is a collector of visible thinking. By the time Arthur reached his 60s and 70s, the collection had grown to a size that required a serious response to the question of where to put it. His answer was to live inside it. The apartment on Riverside Drive in Manhattan, where Arthur spent the later decades of his life, was, by every account left by visitors, an extraordinary environment. Every room contained clocks. The walls were lined with them. The surfaces, mantels, tables, shelves that had been built specifically to accommodate the collection were covered with them. There were clocks in cases and clocks on brackets and clocks under glass domes and watches in velvet-lined drawers that could be opened and examined, and clocks in positions of deliberate display where the movements were visible, through glazed panels. There was no room in the apartment where you could not hear the ticking. Visitors who came to see the collection, and there were many, because Arthur was generous with access to scholars and serious collectors, described the experience in terms that varied between wonder and mild disorientation. The sound was the first thing everyone mentioned. The layered, complex, continuous sound of 1,500 mechanical movements, all running simultaneously, all slightly out of phase with each other, producing a texture of sound that was not noise exactly, but was not silence either. It was more like the sound of a forest full, varied, alive, operating according to its own rhythms that had nothing to do with the rhythms of the human beings who moved through it. The chiming, when it came, was described by some visitors as beautiful, and by others as startling. Arthur himself appears to have been entirely untroubled by it. He had lived with the sound for so long that it had become, for him, the sound of home, the particular acoustic character of a space that had been arranged according to his own deepest preferences. The bedroom was, if anything, more densely populated with clocks than the rest of the apartment. This detail that Arthur chose to sleep surrounded by his collection rather than keeping it in dedicated display rooms and sleeping somewhere quieter is the detail that everyone who learns about him finds most revealing. It suggests a relationship with the collection that went beyond scholarship, beyond connoisseurship, beyond the pleasure of owning beautiful and important objects. It suggests that the clocks were company, that the sound of them, the ticking, the chiming, the ongoing mechanical conversation of 1,500 instruments, all measuring the same passage of time in their individual ways, was something Arthur wanted to be present for, even in unconsciousness. There is a philosophical dimension to this that is worth dwelling on. Sleep is the experience of time that we cannot experience the hours that pass without our awareness, the gap in consciousness that happens every night and that we wake from without any direct sense of having traversed. The clocks ticked through Arthur's sleep, measuring the hours he was not measuring, keeping time on his behalf while he was absent from time. In the morning, when he woke, the clocks were still ticking, still running, still counting, still doing the thing they had always done. The night had not stopped them. Think about what it would mean to fall asleep to the sound of clocks. Not one clock 1,500. The sound surrounding you completely, filling the room, rising and falling as different mechanisms complete their cycles, the chiming arriving periodically from different directions in the room. It is either the most anxious imaginable relationship with time or the most peaceful. For Arthur, it was clearly the latter. He had, through years of living with these objects, reached a point where the constant presence of time being measured was not a source of anxiety but of comfort, perhaps because he understood what the clocks were doing, perhaps because familiarity transforms what is strange into what is safe, or perhaps because there is something genuinely soothing about the sound of a machine doing exactly what it was made to do, reliably, without complaint, in the dark. Every morning, James Arthur wound his clocks. Not all 1,500. Many of them ran for 8 days or more on a single winding, and some of the precision regulators ran for months. But a significant portion of the collection required daily or weekly attention, and Arthur gave it. The winding was not a chore. It was a ritual, a daily physical engagement with each object in the collection, a moment of contact with the mechanism, a small act of maintenance that kept the clocks running and that kept Arthur connected to them. To wind a clock is to give it energy. You turn the key or pull the chain and the mainspring tightens or the weight rises, and the stored energy that will drive the mechanism for the next day or week or month is transferred from your body, from the muscles of your hand, wrist into the machine. There is something in this transaction that is more intimate than simply owning an object. You are, in a literal sense, part of the clock's operation. Without your regular intervention, it stops. With it, it runs. The relationship between a collector and a mechanical collection is not passive in the way that the relationship between a collector and, say, a painting collection is passive. Paintings do not need to be wound. They do not stop if you neglect them. A clock that is not wound is a stopped clock, an object that has become, temporarily, merely decorative, that has ceased to perform its fundamental function. Arthur's daily attention was, in this sense, the thing that kept the collection alive. It was a relationship of mutual dependence, the collection requiring the collector as much as the collector required the collection. In 1894, James Arthur published a book. Its title was Time and Its Measurement, and it was dedicated to the proposition that the history of clockmaking was one of the most important and most neglected chapters in the history of human civilization. The book is not easy reading. It is the work of a man who has spent decades mastering a technical subject and who writes about it with the assumption that his reader is willing to follow him into the details. There are chapters on the theory of the escapement, on the mathematics of gear trains, on the metallurgy of balance springs, on the history of the pendulum and the mathematics of its motion. There are biographical chapters on the great clockmakers Harrison, Graham, Tompion, Breguet, Arnold that read as portraits of intellectual characters as much as technical histories. But there is also, running through the book, something more personal, a sustained argument about the significance of what these makers had done and why it mattered. Arthur believed and argued at length that the development of accurate timekeeping was the single most important technological development of the modern era, more important than the steam engine, more important than the printing press, more important than the discoveries of physics and chemistry that his contemporaries celebrated most enthusiastically. His argument ran as follows. All of the other technological achievements of the modern era depended at their foundation on the ability to measure time accurately. The steam engine required synchronized pistons. The railroad required synchronized schedules. Scientific experiments required precise measurements of duration. Navigation required accurate time. And all of these requirements pointed back to the same chain of innovation, to the men who had spent their lives in workshops trying to find one more increment of accuracy in the measurement of a second. The argument was not entirely original. Versions of it had been made before, but Arthur's version had the authority of a man who had handled the actual objects, who had felt in his hands the difference between a movement of ordinary quality and one of extraordinary precision, who had wound the actual clocks and watched the actual escapements and understood, from direct physical experience, what the achievement of accuracy had required from the people who pursued it. Arthur's scholarly work was not confined to the book. He maintained, for decades, an extensive correspondence with the leading horologists of Europe and America, men who recognized in him an equal, despite his lack of formal training in the craft, and who found in his questions and observations the marks of a genuinely serious mind. The correspondence ranged across all the subjects that occupied the field: the attribution of unsigned movements to specific makers, the dating of undated pieces, the interpretation of technical features that distinguish the work of one workshop from another, the provenance of significant objects that had passed through the market and whose history was imperfectly documented. Arthur was, in these exchanges, consistently modest about his own opinions and consistently rigorous about the evidence qualities that made him a valued correspondent rather than merely a rich collector seeking validation. He also corresponded with the great public collections, the South Kensington Museum in London, the Conservatoire des Arts et Métiers in Paris, the Smithsonian in Washington, exchanging information about the pieces in their collections and in his, building up a shared understanding of where the most significant objects in the history of horology were to be found and what they represented. This network of exchanges was, in a sense, a distributed library, a body of knowledge about clocks and watches that existed in the correspondence and in the memories of the people who participated in it as much as in any single collection or publication. Arthur lectured. He spoke to historical societies, to engineering clubs, to the audiences of the growing number of organizations that were beginning, in the late 19th and early 20th century, to take seriously the history of technology as a distinct field of inquiry. The lectures were, by the accounts of people who heard them, unusual experiences. Arthur would bring objects, would carry actual clocks and watches to the podium and pass them through the audience, trusting his listeners with pieces that were, by any measure, irreplaceable. He believed that objects needed to be handled to be understood, that the knowledge you could get from touching a mechanism was different in kind from the knowledge you could get from looking at a photograph or reading a description. He wanted his audiences to feel the weight of a marine chronometer, to notice the texture of the engraving on the case of a 16th century German drum clock, to hear the particular sound of a specific escapement. There is a kind of generosity in this that is easy to overlook. To pass an object that you have spent a lifetime and a fortune acquiring through the hands of strangers, trusting them to handle it with care, believing that the experience of direct contact is worth the risk, that is not the behavior of a man who simply wants to own things. That is the behavior of a man who wants to share what he knows, and who believes that the objects themselves are the most effective teachers. There is, running through Arthur's relationship with his clocks, a philosophical question that he addressed directly in his book, and indirectly in everything else he wrote and said: what is time? Not what time is it, that is the question the clock answers. What is time itself, the thing being measured, the medium through which all experience moves, the dimension that distinguishes what has been from what is from what will be? This is one of the oldest and hardest questions in philosophy, and the history of the answers is almost as complex as the history of clockmaking itself. Aristotle defined time as the measure of motion according to before and after time, as something that only exists in relation to change, to the movement of things from one state to another. Without motion, without change, there would be no time. Augustine of Hippo, wrestling with the same question 15 centuries later, arrived at the famous formulation that time was a distension of the soul, that past, present, and future were not features of the external world, but categories of the mind, the memory of the past, the attention to the present, the anticipation of the future. Newton, whose mechanics provided the theoretical foundation for the clockmaker's practice, treated time as absolute, as a flow that was independent of anything happening in the universe, as a backdrop against which events occurred. Time, for Newton, was the same everywhere, flowing at the same rate regardless of what was happening, a universal constant against which all motion could be measured. Einstein, who was working on the theory that would overturn Newton's absolute time in the years that Arthur was still winding his clocks in the Riverside Drive apartment, showed that time was neither absolute nor universal, that the rate at which it passed depended on velocity and gravity, that two clocks at different altitudes or moving at different speeds would measure different amounts of time passing over the same interval. The universe's most fundamental timekeeper was not a clock at all, but the structure of space-time itself, and it was not uniform. Arthur does not appear to have engaged directly with relativity. His book predates it, and he was in his 70s when Einstein's papers began to circulate. But the question that relativity addressed, the question of what time actually is, beneath the practical business of measuring it, was one that Arthur had spent his life circling, approaching from the direction of the objects rather than the direction of theory. There is, running through Arthur's relationship with his clocks, a philosophical question that he addressed directly in his book and indirectly in everything else he wrote and said, "What is time?" Not "what time is it?" That is the question the clock answers. What is time itself, the thing being measured, the medium through which all experience moves, the dimension that distinguishes what has been from what is from what will be? This is one of the oldest and hardest questions in philosophy, and the history of the answers is almost as complex as the history of clockmaking itself. Aristotle defined time as the measure of motion, according to before and after time, as something that only exists in relation to change, to the movement of things from one state to another. Without motion, without change, there would be no time. Augustine of Hippo, wrestling with the same question 15 centuries later, arrived at the famous formulation that time was a distension of the soul, that past, present, and future were not features of the external world, but categories of the mind, the memory of the past, the attention to the present, the anticipation of the future. Newton, whose mechanics provided the theoretical foundation for the clockmaker's practice, treated time as absolute, as a flow that was independent of anything happening in the universe, as a backdrop against which events occurred. Time, for Newton, was the same everywhere, flowing at the same rate regardless of what was happening, a universal constant against which all motion could be measured. Einstein, who was working on the theory that would overturn Newton's absolute time in the years that Arthur was still winding his clocks in the Riverside Drive apartment, showed that time was neither absolute nor universal, that the rate at which it passed depended on velocity and gravity, that two clocks at different altitudes or moving at different speeds would measure different amounts of time passing over the same interval. The universe's most fundamental timekeeper was not a clock at all, but the structure of space-time itself, and it was not uniform. Arthur does not appear to have engaged directly with relativity. His book predates it, and he was in his 70s when Einstein's papers began to circulate. But the question that relativity addressed, the question of what time actually is, beneath the practical business of measuring it, was one that Arthur had spent his life circling, approaching from the direction of the objects rather than the direction of theory. He was not collecting time. He was collecting the human response to time, the ingenuity, the patience, the obsessive precision of the people who had devoted their lives to measuring something that refused to be held. Late at night, in the apartment on Riverside Drive, when Arthur was in bed and the city outside had quieted to its minimal late-night register, the clocks filled the darkness. The ticking was not uniform. It rose and fell in its collective density as different mechanisms completed their cycles and paused and resumed. There were moments very brief, statistically improbable, but occurring occasionally by the pure mathematics of asynchronous rhythms, when many clocks ticked at nearly the same moment, producing a brief intensification of the sound, a gathering, and then a release. There were other moments when the ticking was sparse, spread out, each clock speaking briefly and alone before another answered. The chiming was more dramatic. At certain hours, midnight most of all, when every clock that chimed had something to say, the room filled with overlapping sequences of bells, each clock playing its particular voice in its particular rhythm, the combination producing something that was neither music nor noise, but something between the two, a complex chord of meaning and mechanism. Arthur lay in the middle of all this and slept. Or perhaps did not always sleep immediately, perhaps lay for a while in the dark, listening, following individual voices in the collective sound, identifying this clock or that one by its particular tick, its particular chime, the specific signature of its escapement that he had learned over years of close attention, a kind of listening that was also a kind of knowing, the satisfaction of recognizing, in the dark, the specific presence of each object he had chosen. What would it mean to know a place so well, to be so intimate with the specific character of every object in it, that you could navigate it by sound alone? Arthur could do this. In the dark, in the middle of the night, the clocks told him where he was and what surrounded him. He was not merely in a room. He was in the middle of 4 centuries of human ingenuity, all of it running, all of it keeping time on his behalf, all of it saying in its mechanical, non-metaphorical way that the night was passing and the morning would come. Arthur entered his 70s and then his 80s, still collecting, still writing, still lecturing, still winding his clocks each morning with the consistency that had characterized his relationship with the collection for half a century. The world around him had changed enormously. The electric clock was becoming practical and widespread. The telephone and the radio had transformed the transmission of time signals. It was now possible for anyone with a radio receiver to synchronize their clocks with national observatories broadcasting accurate time to the second, making the kind of personal timekeeping discipline that Arthur represented seem, to some, slightly antiquated. The automobile was transforming the city. The first wristwatches were beginning to displace the pocket watch that had been the standard form of portable timekeeping for 4 centuries. Arthur watched all of this with the attention of a man who understood its historical significance. He wrote about the electric clock, about the radio time signal, about the wristwatch, integrating these new developments into the long narrative of horological history that he had spent his life constructing. He was not hostile to novelty. He was too intelligent and too genuinely curious for that. But he maintained, as a matter of conviction rather than nostalgia, that the mechanical clock represented something that the electric clock and the radio time signal did not: the visible, audible, tangible embodiment of the human effort to understand and measure time. An electric clock tells you the time. A mechanical clock shows you the measurement happening, the escapement releasing, the gear train turning, the hands advancing in their small increments, each movement the result of energy stored in a spring or a weight, passing through a mechanism of extraordinary refinement. The electric clock makes the process invisible. The mechanical clock makes it visible. For Arthur, the difference was the difference between a fact and an understanding. In the years before his death, Arthur began to think carefully about what would happen to the collection. He was not wealthy enough, by the standards of the great American collectors of his era, to endow a museum. The clocks and watches represented the accumulated investment of a lifetime of business success, but they were not, in the way of the great art collections of the period, worth the kind of money that could sustain an independent institution. He made inquiries. He corresponded with the New York Public Library, with the Metropolitan Museum, with the Smithsonian. He wanted the collection to remain intact, to continue to function as the systematic library of horological history that he had spent 50 years assembling, rather than being dispersed into the general holdings of an institution where individual pieces might be significant, but the collection as a whole would lose its meaning. The New York Public Library eventually received a significant portion of the collection, along with Arthur's papers and correspondence. This was not the ideal outcome. A library is not a natural home for clocks, but it preserved the collection in a way that kept it accessible to scholars, and it preserved the books and papers that documented Arthur's thinking about what the collection meant. Some of the finest individual pieces went to other museums, where they have been displayed and studied and used to teach the history of clockmaking to generations of visitors and students. The marine chronometers, the early German table clocks, the precision regulators. These objects, dispersed from the apartment on Riverside Drive, where they had ticked together for decades, now occupy display cases in institutions across the country, telling their individual stories to audiences who may not know that they were once part of something larger, part of a collection assembled with a specific argument in mind by a man who slept surrounded by them every night. James Arthur died in 1930, at the age of 88. He had outlived most of his contemporaries in the horological world. He had outlived the era of the pocket watch and seen the beginning of the era of the wristwatch. He had outlived the era of hand-wound clocks as the primary timekeepers of daily life and seen the beginning of the era of electric and battery-powered clocks that would, over the next decades, make the mechanical clock a specialty rather than a standard. The clocks were still ticking when he died. They would have continued ticking for some days afterward, winding down gradually as the mainsprings released their stored energy without being replenished, the pendulums swinging with decreasing authority, the balance wheels oscillating more and more slowly until, one by one, each clock reached the end of its reserve and stopped. The apartment would have gone quiet over the course of a week, not all at once, but gradually, each silence arriving as a specific clock reached its terminus, until the room that had been full of sound for decades was finally still. That gradual going quiet is one of the more melancholy images available to the imagination in this story. Not the death of the man, that was, after 88 full years, a completion rather than a catastrophe, but the clocks running down, one by one, in a room where no one was winding them anymore. The sound of a lifetime's work ending not with a single moment, but with a long, distributed, mechanical diminuendo. The clocks that James Arthur collected are, most of them, still running. Not in the apartment on Riverside Drive, which no longer exists as he knew it. Not in the configuration he had arranged them in, surrounded by each other, filling the room with their collective sound. But individually, in museums and private collections and the institutions that received them after his death, wound by curators and conservators who understand what they are and what they represent, a mechanical clock, properly maintained, can run indefinitely. This is one of the things that distinguishes it from almost every other kind of machine. It does not wear out if it is cared for, does not become obsolete in the way that functional machines become obsolete, does not cease to perform its essential function simply because time has passed. A clock from the 17th century, wound and running in the 21st, is not a museum piece in the usual sense. It is an instrument that is doing what it was made to do, 400 years after it was made. This is, perhaps, the final thing that drew Arthur to clocks above all other objects. They do not decline. They do not age in the way that most things age. They are, in their fundamental operation, immune to the process they measure. The clock that counts the seconds does not itself deteriorate with each second. It persists, in its running, as a refutation of the impermanence it documents. Arthur understood this, and spent 88 years living with the paradox of it. The clock said, "Time is passing," and the clock said, "I am still here." Both were true. Both are still true. Somewhere tonight, in a museum case or a private collection, one of Arthur's clocks is still running. Its escapement is still releasing, its gear train is still turning, its pendulum is still swinging. The specific object that he chose, at some moment decades or a century ago, because he recognized in it the embodiment of a particular human achievement, that object is still doing the thing it was made to do. Still measuring, still counting, still keeping time on behalf of whoever is in the room with it. In the apartment on Riverside Drive, late at night, surrounded by 1,500 clocks, James Arthur slept. The clocks ticked. The hours passed. The morning came. It always did.